The focus of Chapter 10 is on substance abuse crimes, mainly on drug crime. Today we think of certain substances as being illegal, and probably they were illegal forever. Well, that's not really true. What we find is that many of these substances either weren't created until the 1800s, the 1900s, maybe even more recently, and so therefore they couldn't have been prohibited if they weren't invented. But even those that were in existence, we find that there was either no regulation or very little regulation, or even efforts to promote the use of these substances by Western powers that now condemn drug use. So let's take a look at some of the early days of the drug trade. In the 1800s, as China opened up to the West, there was a trade imbalance. China had silk and spices and other kinds of replenishable goods that it was trading to Western powers, so European powers, to Americans, for gold, for silver, for other precious metals that were not so easily replenished. So the Western powers were concerned about this because they were trading their gold and couldn't easily replace it, and the Chinese were trading their silk and their spices that they could easily replace every year. And so the Western powers were looking for different kinds of commodities that they could use that could be replenished and that they could trade with the Chinese rather than their precious metals. Opium was one of these commodities. It was seen as a way to correct this imbalance. So the Western powers, including the United States, so the United States, European powers like the British, the French, the Germans, were engaged in cultivating opium and trading it with the Chinese for other kinds of goods that the Western powers were interested in. China soon realized what opium was doing to its people. So the most common way that opium was being used in China was to smoke opium, and the Chinese were eventually realized the damage that it was causing to its people through addiction. They didn't call it addiction necessarily back then, but it's what we would call addiction today. They decided to stop this trade. Also, it was causing, the Chinese preferred to have gold instead of opium, so it was an economic problem as well that the Western powers were evening out that imbalance with the Chinese. So the Chinese attempted to stop the opium importation in the 1830s through the 1850s. This resulted in two opium wars being fought mostly by the British, but also French and German were involved to some degree. These weren't major wars. The British had the most powerful navy, and what had happened was the governor of Hong Kong shut off the port of Hong Kong so that the British couldn't bring in their ships with opium on them anymore, and the British sent over their warships, fired off their weapons, fired off their guns, fought some battles over the course of a few years, and eventually defeated the Chinese in the First Opium War and gained control of Hong Kong. A few years later, once again, some Chinese governors tried to shut down the ports and prohibit the importation of opium. And once again, similar kind of result. The British shut off their warships' guns and forced the Chinese to capitulate. And this time the British gained even more concessions to allow them to even more freely trade opium within China. So in the early days, the Western powers that now fight against drugs and the trade in drugs were heavily involved in it. In fact, some of the advances in maritime engineering and shipbuilding were due to the opium trade, because opium was mostly grown in Turkey and India, and the Western powers wanted to make as many shipments from Turkey and India in the 1800s to China as possible before the typhoon season hit. So faster and stronger boats were built. So this had a lasting impact on the shipbuilding industry. But we also had in the 1800s the development of various substances we never had before. So for instance, you may be familiar with, if you're German, you might pronounce it as Bayer, but we often in America call it Bayer. It's a major pharmaceutical company that's been around since the 1800s. They invented two what they called wonder drugs in the 1800s. One was aspirin, so obviously we still use that today, and the other was heroin. We didn't fully understand the consequences of some of these substances like heroin. We didn't understand addiction. We didn't understand dependence and the other kinds of harms that can be caused to the body and the mind by these drugs. So heroin was really seen as this new wonder drug that would deal with all the pains in society. It could deaden pain. Um, so, given that there were multiple wars going on around the world, the American Civil War obviously took a major toll on the American population, but on the battlefield there was a constant hunt for some kind of substance that could deaden pain, because the typical way that you dealt with a serious injury to a limb on the battlefield was to amputate that limb, and often without any kind of anesthesia. Give the soldier a piece of leather to chew on, maybe give them some alcohol, give them a bullet to bite on, any of those kinds of things, and then cut off their leg. And so when new drugs like morphine and heroin were created that could deaden the pain, these were seen as wonder drugs. Sigmund Freud, who was making his name in psychiatry in the 1800s, was proclaiming the benefits of cocaine. He viewed it as a magical cure for all kinds of mental illnesses like depression and lethargy and all kinds of others. So he was a user himself, and he encouraged the use among others. We even see the use of cocaine drops for infants to deal with teething. We see the use of opiates for infants as well. So they're giving cocaine, they're giving opiates to infants because we didn't really understand the consequences. And when I say opiate, I mean opiates are any kinds of drugs like morphine, heroin, those kinds of things that are created from the poppy. And we take raw opium from a poppy, from a plant. So if you've ever seen The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy falls down and in the one scene and falls asleep, she and the lion fall asleep in the field of poppies. Well, if they harvested the bulbs that are part of the poppy plant, they'd find that there was a sap inside that could be eventually processed into various kinds of opiates like morphine, like heroin, through a chemical process. So that's what I mean when I say opiates. But also, coca leaves were used in South America by the indigenous population to chew on them, to give them more energy, to give them more strength. And so we eventually learned about these plants and brought them into the American mainstream and the European mainstream in their use. So, for instance, Coca-Cola, it was called Coca-Cola because it contained cocaine. Now, not powder cocaine, obviously, but they used the cocoa plants to get the taste and also the stimulant, the quality that cocaine gives you. And so Coca-Cola was originally the real thing. In fact, Coca-Cola is the only company in the United States that's still legally allowed to import coca leaves. Now, those coca leaves are brought into New Jersey. The cocaine part of them, so to speak, is removed, but the taste is still part of the coca leaf taste is still part of the secret recipe of Coca-Cola. In the 1800s in the United States, if we just focus on the United States, there were really two major kinds of addicts, and these were opiate addicts. We had an influx of Chinese workers, so the United States made deals with China to bring in Chinese to work on, mostly in the West, to work on, for instance, the Transcontinental Railroad, and these were terrible conditions that the Chinese workers faced. It was basically slave labor. And so they often used opium to dull the pain. So white Americans viewed this opium as a wonder drug that made almost supermen out of the Chinese. What they didn't realize is if you live on opium, you're probably going to die pretty soon. You're not going to have a long life expectancy. So you could have, go for long periods of time and endure very painful and strenuous conditions. But you probably weren't going to live that long. And so the Chinese were mostly noted for smoking opium. This was an addiction they carried with them from China, from the Opium War days. And so the opium den was famous. One of the things we'll see throughout the history of American drug policy is the use of racism to bring about new laws against certain kinds of substances. So there was this real concern in popular literature and the press about the opium den, the evils of it, that virtuous white women would be lured into the opium den and become prostitutes and sex slaves. So smoking opium was mainly associated with the Chinese. However, there was another group of addicts who weren't the target of the early drug laws. And these were mostly, it could include men, but they were often middle to upper class women who drank these patent medicines that they could buy through Sears and Roebuck catalog and through other, you know, there were no regulations stopping them from buying these things, and no one really knew what was in them. But they mostly contained laudanum, which is an opiate that allowed them to dull the pain. Some inject it, so they didn't just drink these patent medicines and elixirs, but they also inject it. And this was mainly done in their houses, not out in public, not in some opium den, but mainly because it wasn't respectable for women to go to bars. So the men had their drinking that they could do to dull life's pain. The women used these opiates to allow them to feel euphoric, to dull the pain of everyday life. When the first drug prohibitions were passed, they were mainly directed at smoking opium. So really wasn't an attempt to criminalize what the middle to upper class women were doing. The main thrust was to punish what the Chinese were doing, which was smoking opium. This was largely because China was protesting the conditions that their workers were enduring. And so America thought they could gain back some of Chinese favor by passing these laws to ban the smoking of opium.